of the co-directors of the Centre for Democratic Engagement. I'm Professor of Politics at the University of Leeds, and I'm really, really pleased to welcome you all to this event, where we have three speakers approaching the climate emergency and democracy from very different perspectives, and I'm sure it'll be a really, really interesting event. So I'll introduce my colleague Helen in a minute to introduce the event properly, but throughout we'll have presentations and then an opportunity for Q&A at the end. Throughout the presentations, throughout the event, if you want to put your camera on, please by all means do, because it's nice to see faces. It always gives more of a sense of a community here. But do keep your mics off if that's okay throughout the duration, unless we ask you to ask a question at the end. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Helen Graham from the Centre for Critical Studies for Museums, Galleries and Heritage.
Thank you so much, Christina. So the event today is part of a collaborative event series called Designing for Democratic Engagement, which is a collaboration between the Centre for Democratic Engagement that Christina is part of and another centre that I'm part of, as Christina's just said, the Centre for Critical Studies in Museums, Galleries and Heritage. The event series is a response to the sense that when we think about adaptation to climate change or other questions that are urgent at the moment, such as decolonising institutions, there are good reasons for thinking that current forms of liberal representative democracy linked to the defined boundaries of nation states and expressed through delegated authority to professionals will not suffice. So through the events in this series, we've been exploring how democratic engagement can be redesigned and reimagined. So Designing for Democratic Engagement intersects with another event series that's being run by the Centre for Critical Studies in Museums, Galleries and Heritage called Museum Legitimacies, where we're seeking to pick up debates from other academic disciplines and sectors and apply and rework ideas for democratic challenges that the museum and heritage sector face. And this is really going to be reflected, this interest is going to be reflected in Henry McGee's contribution today, who works very closely around questions of climate change and museums and heritage. So today's event, all three speakers are exploring questions of how democratic and institutional forms can respond to climate emergency. In particular, the different perspectives offered by the speakers indicate a crucial range of issues in this debate, whether related to political ontologies that might include action, not only decision making, and might need to expand to include the more than human, whether it's the role of individual people's norms and behaviours within wider system change, or whether ideas of rights, whether human rights or perhaps rights given to the more than human, may play a role in reimagining our political systems and institutions, whether that's logics of democracy, whether universities, or whether cultural institutions such as museum and heritage organisations. So I'm going to hand back to Christina now to introduce our panel.
Thanks very much, Helen. So we've got a fantastic panel. We're really, really pleased and privileged really to have Robyn Eckersley here with us today, who's talking to us directly from Australia. So Robyn is a professor of political science at the University of Melbourne and has written extensively on issues of environmental politics, political theory, international relations, always with a focus on ethics, politics, and the governance of climate change. And her 2004 book, The Green State, has received multiple awards, and she's very much sought of in terms of external fellowships, etc., on this topic. So we're really, really pleased and honoured to have you here with us, Robyn. And Robyn will draw from her work on democracy and climate emergency to elaborate a little bit on her conceptualization of ecological democracy 3.0 and address the issues that Helen pointed out in her introduction. And then Robyn will be followed by Victoria. So Victoria Spacer is an associate professor in sustainability research and computational social science at the University of Leeds in the Centre for Democratic Engagement, the Politics of International Studies, and she has a UKRI fellowship, which is looking at norms and norms governing behaviour and how we can accelerate social change to address the issues of the climate crisis. So she'll draw from that project to address the issues that we've outlined. And so again, so straight away you see here two very different perspectives coming together. And then Henry McGee will bring in a different perspective again, more from the Heritage Museum perspective. So Henry founded curating tomorrow in 2019, I think. And it's very much about empowering museums to contribute to sustainable development and to think about how museums and those spaces can work through to achieve those goals of, sustainable development goals, but also to address human rights and environmental rights through those means. So again, he'll draw from that experience to address the questions that Helen mentioned. So without further ado, I'm really, really pleased to pass the floor to Robyn, who will share her screen, I think, with the presentation.
Well, firstly, thank you very much to Christina and Helen for inviting me on this particular webinar. So as you can see from the pictures on my slide, my first slide, I'm speaking from Australia, so good evening to everyone. And the pictures here have very much informed my presentation today, this morning. The first picture is of the Black Summer fires of 2019 to 2020, which burned more than 24 million hectares, roughly the size of the UK, and lasted for a period of about 7 months. We're now at the tail end of another climate emergency. The spaces between them seems to be lessening. A massive flood on the east coast of Australia, which is still unfolding. There's more than 30,000 people have lost their homes. There's been deaths, there's been destruction of wildlife. And the federal government has been very slow to respond, leaving it to volunteers to rescue people from death and harm. So this emergency politics is really front and center in Australia at the moment. So what I want to do is build on a paper I wrote in 2019, which I won't have the time to go through, where I talked about two versions of ecological democracy, version 1 and version 2. And these were different from what I understood the normal practices of citizens' environmental movements since the birth of the modern environment movement, at least in OECD countries, which was to work with the grain of liberal democracy, use the full range of human or civil and political rights to expose problems, demand more information, insist on transparency, put environmental rights, procedural and substantive in constitutions, and move towards rights of nature. These were all like friendly internal critics of liberal democracy. But in the early 90s, when democracy was kind of at its heyday after the USSR imploded, everyone took a more cosmopolitan and idealist turn. And as a result, this was more critical, looking at the fundamental coordinates of democracy and trying to enlarge them, that is space, time, community and agency, and thinking of a range of radical democratic innovations to supplement, not supplant, existing democracy. But since then, democracy has fallen on hard times, and we've seen a different version, a more communitarian version, more interested in everyday life, more disillusioned with the state, focusing on material practices, changing the flow, working towards sustainable flows of food, energy, fashion, you name it. And also partly turning away from the professionalism of the environmental movement, which wasn't really resonating with many members of the public. John Meyer calls that the resonance dilemma. Now, I don't have the time to go through all of these now, but that was the background to maybe think, what would ecological democracy 3.0 mean? And it's sort of come to me without even me choosing it, and that's climate emergency and democracy. Now here, I want to explore the tensions between whether this is indeed a new form of democracy or a new form of authoritarianism. So I want to start with a critique of climate emergency claim making. And it's basically that this is a form of Schmittian state of exception. It's a securitization move which will necessarily truncate, if not fully suspend, democracy. It appeals to strong leadership, it appeals to the state, it invokes sovereignty. Some see it as a return to the radical eco-authoritarianism of the early 1970s. Excuse me. It's an appeal to a kind of eco-catastrophism. Some say a return to the Christian eschatology of, end of time coming our way. It is said to play into the hands of technocratic and scientific elites. Mike Hume, who's probably one of the major critics, says it simplifies a complex problem into carbon, comes up with simple deadlines and targets, and so the emergency will last until we reach them. And it's a return to high modernism, like we're seeing like a state trying to revive this idea of progress and the rational application of science and reason as we manage populations. Now, funnily enough, I find this critique more troubling than the problem that they're trying to raise. Why do I find this troubling? Because they set up a false binary choice between liberal freedoms and authoritarianism, and there are many other options. It is trapped in a Schmittian framework, as if all climate emergency is confected in the way that Hitler staged the Reichstag fire in order to reach for emergency powers and invoke a state of exception. It fails to acknowledge the multiple ecological deficits of actually existing liberal democracy, which is no different to firms. They pass on ecological costs through space and time for a whole lot of reasons I'm sure you're all familiar with. So these are questions we need to ask the critics of climate emergency, which is not to say there aren't dangers. And that is, in what ways might the climate emergency movement actually enhance democracy? And also, there are always democratic risks on every side of a decision. So if democracy is imperiled by the emergency mode, which is what the critics say, then what might happen to democracy if we fail to get to zero as quickly as possible? That's the question I would put back to them. So we can look at the grammar of emergency politics, an imminent, dangerous, existential threat that requires the suspension of normal politics and demands swift action. I don't see anything necessarily undemocratic about this. I can see huge democratic dangers, but it's not necessarily democratic. It all depends on who makes the decisions, how they're made, whether the rule of law is actually suspended, and whether there's always revisability. These are all key features of democracy. So let me throw up a few more ideal types of democracy. I've introduced you to the Schmittian emergency frame. As Schmitt said, the sovereign is he, note, who decides on the exception. This is pure decisionism. But there's also a form of constitutive or originary power by citizens, a popular or perhaps popular sovereignty, or a Deweyan public where people come together over common concerns to raise a matter, and they often seek the traits of a state, or the multitude against empire, to quote Michael Hart. And this is all a response to state failure to protect. And there's a third version, which I think is probably my ideal, which is democratically authorised, accountable state emergency services and community organisations and volunteers collectively responding to real palpable emergencies like floods, fires. We've seen this fail spectacularly just in the last few weeks in Australia, where the Defence Forces were sent in about 5 days after the flood had reached its high point. So if you look at the movement in its own words, like Extinction Rebellion, it has its problems, but tell the truth, halt biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, create citizens' assemblies. That's hardly democratic. We have an emergency. Let's have a slow deliberation to think about how we can collectively reshape our future. Or is the climate emergency movement actually began in Melbourne in the Darebin City Council, and Jane Morton was one of the key activists. The first climate emergency rally was held in Melbourne in 2009. She's responding to the disinformation campaign. So this tell the truth is not so much there's a capital T truth, it's just we're sick of hearing disinformation and lies. So if normal politics has failed us, has brought the whole planet to the brink of ecological disaster, clearly we need not the suspension of normal politics, but a new normal. This is Britain's own Farhana Yamin in This Is Not a Drill. So I think there's some grounds to show that the climate emergency movement is actually enriching democracy, not across the board, but in some areas, by widening horizons to consider future generations, the more than human world, responding to climate denialism and post-truth, and also pioneering new forms of democratic deliberation about the future. We've seen it in France, we've seen it in Britain, we've seen it in Ireland. They're not all perfect, but they're extending the range of viewpoints. Now, how well do these emergency claims resonate? Well, actually, they've caught on in many ways. Certainly, scientists believe there's a climate emergency. For many, it's just a rhetoric or a code or a placeholder for we're really concerned and we want everyone to hurry up. There's also the Climate Ambition Summit, where the UN Secretary General urged all countries to declare a global climate emergency, and a global survey of about 50 countries found that about nearly 2/3 of those surveyed believe we're in one. So I think we need a more rounded view here. Securitization and climate emergency are sometimes bad, but not always bad. Fear can mobilize in the short term, and there are good reasons to be fearful, but of course it can't be sustained, and that's a problem I'll return to. The climate challenge can't be addressed without heeding science, but that doesn't mean we block out other forms of knowledge. We desperately need them. Here in Australia, especially Indigenous knowledge of fire stick farming and coal burning to stop great conflagrations of the kind we've just seen. We need climate targets and timetables. That's the only way to get a job done, but that doesn't exhaust a wide range of other policy measures. We need the mobilization of the state. We cannot solve this problem behind the back of states, but doesn't rule out massive local action. We've seen climate emergency bills, but there's nothing about them, and I'm also a lawyer, that bothers me from a civil rights point of view. They're all revisable, repealable, amendable. So climate emergency may, but doesn't necessarily truncate democracy. So here though, what do we do to sustain that mobilization? Because in the US, the movement's called climate mobilization, and that's the thing we're really interested in. And I'm gonna have to flick through this quickly because my 15 minutes are nearly up. So I guess my argument here, and I'll just put it up really fast and just talk over it. Mitigation is much harder to democratize. It has less democratic potential than adaptation for a whole bunch of reasons, which I'll unpack later. Maybe we can return to this slide. But the primary thing is that all adaptation efforts are local. There's greater buy-in. There's greater opportunity for local coalitions of the willing. Less opportunities for the concentrated losers of business to lobby at the national level, which is very streamlined for them, where the diffuse beneficiaries are disorganized. There's also better opportunities for social learning, for using a range of different knowledges. And once that happens in terms of adaptation, which affects everyone in local places, they realize how important mitigation is. You can get to mitigation via adaptation. For a long time, the movement thought, don't talk about adaptation, it's giving up the ghost on mitigation, but in fact, adaptation is the key to getting back to mitigation because it lowers the costs of adaptation. So to conclude, and I haven't properly sketched modes 1 and 2 for you to really grasp these differences, I see the climate emergency movement as continuing to widen our horizons in space and time, but they've added this new dimension of pace of change in relation to irreversible problems. And this is a knotty problem for Democrats. How do you move fast? Because democracy is slow. It's addressed to the state, unlike the second version, but it also seeks to empower citizens. It's oppositional and sometimes transgressive. And this claim making is now part of ordinary politics. It resonates to some extent, not with everyone, and we need to work on that. I think adaptation is the key. And adaptation politics, as I said, has more democratic possibilities. So I'm probably a minute over time here, and I apologize, but I want to finish with R.G. Collingwood. Theory arises out of practice, and to practice returns for its resolution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robyn. That was absolutely brilliant and a really good setting out the context before we go to Victoria's presentation. Actually, there's a lot of things that I think Victoria will talk about, linking really well with what you were saying in terms of adaptation being the best approach rather than mitigation, but also about the pace of change and how do we go about to achieve that pace of change which is needed when, as you say, democracy is slow. So we'll pass on to Victoria now, who'll take up from the perspective of her research on norms and how to address that through that perspective. So over to you, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Christina, and also thank you very much for the invitation to be on this really great panel. So I kind of will approach this based on those 4 questions that kind of Helen has suggested for us as a panel to consider. So I will always refer to my research project, but it's not only going to be just about my research project itself, and considering the wider perspective. So maybe we can just go to the next slide. So I think it's important to kind of to stress out like how important this kind of social science, the political science perspective is on climate emergency, because there is a danger. I mean, as Robyn has mentioned, like, you know, like kind of to look at it like from more of a technocratic kind of perspective, kind of to try to find technological solutions to the climate emergency, particularly when we look into mitigation. But I think, and there was actually quite an interesting response to an editorial that Nature has published. Nature is like this big kind of journal on climate emergency, where they haven't mentioned at all the social science perspective. And there was a response then from three social scientists kind of said, like, this is like really wrong, and this is like, what gets us into this trouble, because what we kind of naively assume is like, that of course all those technological solutions that are out there will just be adapted, will just be taken up without, any kind of, resistance or any kind of issues. And they stress out, like, that fighting climate change will depend crucially on people's support for transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. This people support, how do we get people support for the transition, for the social change, for the change that we need to see? This is like, where social science comes in, where political science comes in, and where we have to start thinking about. Next slide, please. So my research, I'm working on this together with my really excellent postdoctoral fellow, Nicole Nisbet. She's today at a net zero retreat, so that's great for her. That's why she's not with us today here. But we're doing this together at the moment, and hopefully soon we'll be joined by another PhD student as well to work with us. So really what our research is all about is kind of how can we drive the social change? How can we get the kind of the people support, like people on board of the necessary change that we need to see to really face and respond to climate emergency in an effective way? And we build on some recent research that has been looking into like how social change can be accelerated, like how we can make use of nonlinear like tipping dynamics in the social sphere to really drive change. So there's like a quick kind of representation visually of it. Like, so if you think about like, we're at the moment in this kind of business as usual state still in a way, despite all the pledges that we maybe hear, for example, at COP26. And what we need to get to is obviously to a decarbonized state, like where, we have abandoned fossil fuels and other kind of destructive ecological practices. And there are certain kind of barriers, like, of course, like there's always in every social system, there's an inertia, there's like a status quo bias that stabilizes the system as it is. And what we want to look into, like what are the potential factors to to basically draw down those barriers to really facilitate this, this kind of rapid transition. Next slide, please. So considering those four questions that kind of Helen has addressed, and I will always kind of refer back a bit to my research and how they relate to my research. So the first question that Helen and Christina were suggesting was, how might democracy evolve to consider the more than human? And, having been at COP26, for instance, and like having talked a lot about like, with activists and researchers, like one key campaign at the moment that is out there that drives to basically evolve, like to change certain democratic practices and laws on which democracies are based, is to include this more than human perspective. And one of those kind of suggested laws is the ecocide law. So in a recent legal definition of ecocide law developed in June 2021 by an independent expert panel of international environmental lawyers, as well as former international criminal court justice jurists and so on, they suggested ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. What is quite crucial here, and I think this is really a big step forward in a way, because I noticed the debate before like this legal definition came up was that this legal definition is has moved away from the anthropocentric perspective. So because before that, some of the drafts for ecocide law were considering about like how it's actually damaging the humans, like who are living in ecological systems, and only that then becomes basically a crime if it actually damages human civilizations or human communities within those ecosystems. But this definition clearly is going beyond that. So it's not just a crime because it damages human communities in this area. It is a crime on its own if it damages the environment, ecological system on its own. And I think this is shows a certain perspective that includes this. How can we consider more human? We kind of talk about how we can evolve as democracies. And next slide, please. So in a way, I think this kind of the increasing momentum that this campaign is gaining, and they will actually next week, they have a whole week of campaigns on ecocide law to drive it forward. with a strong focus on European Union, because there's a lot of, at the moment at European Union Parliament, a lot of discussion in actually implementing ecocide law. And so I think a lot of it stems like from a shift in norms that we see in the population as well. So this is like an excerpt from a survey that we did, from a pilot survey actually, where we kind of just exploratively looked into like to what extent do people, if they think about like how it is morally wrong to harm other human beings, to be cruel to other human beings, whether they also consider it equally wrong to harm nature, or like creatures who are living, like kind of other non-human creatures. And what we kind of seen in this result is actually that all those, so harming nature and harming human beings loads on the same factor. So it is one dimension. So it seems like, that people who think like harming other humans is morally wrong also think that harming nature is morally wrong. But it's basically considered as equivalent in some way. So we have in a way moved away, like from looking at nature as something like secondary, and kind of focusing only like on human well-being. That we now understand like how like harming nature is also a moral wrong, and should be punished as such. Next slide, please. And yeah, and I think, so on one hand, I think like this kind of normative shift has kind of promoted this law that is now kind of campaigned for. But also, of course, if this law is implemented, it has, of course, its own dynamic that will then reinforce this normative shift even more, because, it will kind of, make like harming nature will begin to feel the same as harming human beings. And that will have like more kind of wide scale perspective, like, consequences, not just because like people will actually like be punished, like criminally punished if they harm nature, but also because that will shift perspectives on like business practices, because this will businesses will have to consider that kind of law before they can make certain decisions where to invest and so on. So the idea is kind of like that this will also then change practices, not just kind of the law itself. Next slide, please. And then maybe like from a more kind of experimental perspective, because I'm also a computational social scientist, I work a lot in the field of machine learning, AI, and so on, and sometimes encounter quite interesting ideas there from those communities. How can we actually, for instance, use AI, so artificial intelligence, machine learning, combined with art to give voice to those who don't have a voice normally, like more than humans. So here I want like just to show you like a brief example of a project of an artist and a machine learning researcher from the Leiden University. They kind of created this video where they used AI to produce letters, basically from ecological systems, to kind of highlight, to give nature a voice. So maybe we can play that video quickly, please, Helen.
I'm sorry, we did practice this. I'm sorry, I don't know why it's.
I think you have maybe to go back to the presentation.
Yeah, if you go to slideshow, you should be able to click on it. Go to slideshow.
You see what I mean? There's no icon there now.
Okay. I think we may have to skip it.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, well, so like in this kind of video, what they show like kind of basically the artificial intelligence kind of produce like a simple letters where they kind of basically say like we're suffering, you have to consider, you shouldn't forget about us. Anyway, like I would encourage you to see this video. Can we quickly go back? And in a way, like that kind of combines with a different ways of thinking of how can we maybe restructure democracies, or how can we make use of new technologies to augment democracy. So there's like a whole idea of augmented democracy. It's the idea of kind of to create like digital twins. So basically like an avatar, a digital representation of every person, and then basically feed them with data to make sure that for instance assess to what extent like certain bills that are passed by the government would be supported by the population, basically letting by the way those those kind of avatars represent those people's preferences, kind of making them kind of vote on bills, that give some kind of perspective what is support for certain bills as in the population. And of course, one could say, okay, so we could create also similar digital twins, not just for people, but also for non-human entities, for ecological systems and so on, and see how would they actually assess certain bills and so on. So this is just kind of a more experimental thought on this question. Next slide, please. So we kind of talked briefly about how there is this certain shift in perspective, and also how we now more see harming nature as equivalent to harming humans. However, our actions have not caught up with this. Clearly, in our behavior, we're not showing the same consideration for nature as we show for humans. So, for instance, this is from a publication from the Hot and Cool Institute from Berlin. They kind of published a 1.5 degree zero lifestyle report, and they look for if we want to have the 1.5 degrees goal met, what would that actually mean for people's lifestyle? How much kind of carbon emissions can they actually produce with their lifestyle choices. And you see here the UK being here in the third row. It's clearly way above here is the barrier for 1.5. So if we want to have 1.5 by 2050, then we have to reduce it to this level. So this is was clearly not there. And you see as well where most of the carbon emissions come from. It's food, it's transport, but also other areas. And I know a lot of the debate is about you cannot just make it about individual choices. There have to be certain kind of structural changes, political changes, and that's absolutely true. But it's not an either or decision. It's both. It's not possible to have political decisions being taken without people changing what they're doing and how they make choices. Every action that we do, the way we vote, the way we speak, how we act, including what kind of actions we're doing, is kind of either maintaining the status quo, which is destroying our earth, or it is kind of trying to drive a social change, because everything is a social signal. And it's not only a social signal to other people, and and then kind of they being then reinforced in their own actions, but also a signal to the politicians. So what are people actually doing? And that's also, of course, influencing what decisions are taken. Maybe next slide, please. So maybe I just want to quickly point out to some debate that has been recently raised on Twitter about behavioralism. That's a new kind of concept that says there's a doctrine that people won't change their behavior to tackle the climate crisis. So existing activities must be swapped with low carbon duplicates, for instance, electric vehicles, flying, and so on. And in a way, and because this assumption is there, people won't change their behavior, we shouldn't even ask them to change their behavior. It kind of props up existing power structures and protects high emitting, high emitting lifestyles and elites. And I think this is important to call this out, because in a democracy, in a way, democracies are about competing ideas, about competing practices, right? And what we are doing gives more of a signal of what is kind of what are the ideas that we're supporting that are winning within democracy than what we might say in a survey, right? So if we behave in a way that is kind of that shows that we are not willing to making sacrifices, then that's what politicians will assume, and then they will try to find solutions that don't bother us with making us change our lifestyles. So I think it is important to consider that as well, and to consider that as an important kind of signal within democracies, how people actually act. It is a choice whether we are drive SUV or a car. It is a choice whether we eat meat every day or not. I mean, this is not just about political structures and social structures. Okay, next slide, please. And I think an important actor here in this context are of course activists in a way. Like I'm here going to, like Robyn has said, I think they're quite important because they're calling out exactly this kind of fraction between what we on the one hand kind of pretend to value, like nature, and on the other hand what we're actually doing, not only on an everyday level, but also like what kind of policies we're supporting, like what kind of policies are advanced. And by calling this out, they're actually driving, normative change that also is not only like represented as a certain kind of high moral ground norms, but also like represented in the social norms, like so what we're actually doing. However, it is of course like on the one hand, like what those movements are kind of suggesting, what kind of new ideas they bring into democracies, and how they actually are then kind of taken up by the population. Next slide, please. And I think here an important
just a couple of minutes.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna head long. So an important role I think here is for researchers to play. So in our work, for instance, what we want to do is kind of to try to use data analysis, for instance, to identify, like, how within social networks, you can spread certain ideas, like, how you can tip social dynamics within certain networks, kind of identifying the key kind of actors within the social networks that are outside the movement, that the movements can, for instance, target to spread, like, their ideas more quicker and to accelerate social change. So I think an important role here is to playing is kind of in cooperation between researchers and activists to co-produce basically rapid social change. And that helps us as a researcher understand so rapid social change, but also like the activists to spread their social change. Next slide, please. And then in terms of like, what this means at the organizational level, I think it's important. So if we want to take people on board, if we want to get people support, it is important to get them involved from the start. And Robyn has already mentioned, climate assemblies are of course one way to do this. And that's also what was demanded by some of the climate protest movements. However, one issue with this is that they're quite often very small scale. So we kind of looked into one of our pilot projects into how we can scale it up by using digital tools to basically facilitate a digital climate assembly. And we kind of tried this in Leeds, Bradford and Hull over like 2 months, where we kind of invited citizens to engage with climate change policies on a local level. And we kind of made quite interesting results on that. Next slide, please. And I think this is like a potential kind of perspective we can also explore, how we can, get people more engaged again, using new ways, new tools, new technologies to make that happen. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, maybe like, that's sorry. Two questions. I can only fit my last slide. I think 2 questions that are also important that we didn't include in those 4 questions, like, how might democracies evolve to consider the voices of children, youth, and more general future generations, because they're at the moment also, like in the present democracies, are obviously excluded because they cannot vote and their voices are not heard, and they are the ones like who are going to suffer. Equally, like, how might democracies evolve to consider global interdependencies, accountabilities, because as you see on this map, it is the global, like the rich countries who are, who have overshoot emissions, but it is kind of the poorer countries who are suffering most. But of course, like when we kind of make democratic decisions in our rich countries, those global south, those voices from those poor people are not included in our democratic decision making, and that again, like, is in a way a failure, and we might need to consider how we can go beyond that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Victoria. That was absolutely brilliant. Covered so much in there. And made a really good transition, I think, between Robyn's talk and then Henry. And in terms of, those ideas of tipping, how do we go about tipping the social dynamics, but also how to use digital skills, digital engagement to galvanize people and to understand about those individual day-to-day behaviors. And now we're going to pass on to Henry, who's going to look at this from a very different perspective in terms of heritage and the role of museums in this area. So over to you, Henry. You're on mute. We can see you. You are mute.
You should hear me now.
Yeah, can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. It wouldn't be the same if someone didn't do something with the mute thing.
It is a Zoom webinar after all.
So I'm going to talk about the relationship between democratic participation on climate action through museums. And so listening to some of the previous talks, thinking from a rights-based approach, I'm not going to talk so much about people in terms of whether they are activists or if they are citizens. I'm going to talk from the rights-based approach that people are people. And so the thing I'm going to talk about, like I'll talk quite a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals as really a governance innovation that we can use to break through some of those structures that we have that have really led us to such a crisis. I also don't talk so much about climate emergency because it has a particular cachet. It can be very off-putting, and in my understanding, a crisis is a short-term situation, largely unforeseen. People have known that climate change was going to come about for over a century. It's a crisis, but it's a crisis. It's a social, a political, and an economic crisis that leads to an environmental one. And so the way I work is I worked in museums for a long time. I used to work as an ecologist, and then I worked in museums for a long time and became super interested in how museums and similar institutions can play a bigger and a more effective role in empowering people to claim basically their basic rights that they should expect in society, but which society is not currently structured to support. And so the way I do this is I write this series of guides that you can get for free. They're easy enough to find on the internet. And they're really to help museums and their partners to get started. And if they need some more support, they pay for my time. And that works really well. Just to talk about these briefly, museums and the Sustainable Development Goals I wrote in 2019. It's on about 20,000 downloads now. It's used in pretty much every country. And it's really to help museums understand how can they connect with and use and support Agenda 2030 and the goals. The other ones I'll mention on the bottom row there, Museums and Human Rights, I wrote in 2020, along with the one on disaster risk reduction, really to try to help museums to make good decisions rather than really poor and short-sighted ones as they come through the pandemic. And also in terms of the Museums and Human Rights one, to encourage museums to ask, well, on what basis do they make their decisions? Is it a small group of powerful people, often the director and a few others, who just decide what they're going to do that year, but based on what? Is to say that human rights are a fantastic framework to use, both in terms of how they make their decisions and using rights-based approaches to transform their institutions and their services. And Action for Climate Empowerment on the bottom right there, I'll come to talk more about. This one I wrote for a big project we had for COP26, headed up by Rodney Harrison at UCL. We developed an exhibition, which I'll come to talk about, and I wrote this toolkit as part of the project, which again you can get for free. It has a web-based version as well, so that it translates. And it's on the next slide as well. That really, I think there are 5 main pathways for climate action, both in and with museums. Obviously, that museums themselves reduce their emissions and adapt to climate change, but also that they support society to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And I think differently perhaps to something that was said earlier, that it's not a case of whether it's adaptation or mitigation. We absolutely need both, and we need them really, really fast. And the danger is that the rich global north countries, seeing rising sea levels, seeing rising floods and so on, they will spend their money on adapting, and they won't play their proper part in reducing their emissions, which of course have a bigger impact on the global south countries that they have historic links with and that they keep in poverty, to be honest. And the last one is to make sure that climate mitigation and adaptation are fair and just, and they contribute to wider sustainable development, because there are many ways to act on climate change that are very, very unfair. And of course, it is people who are already marginalised or underserved who are most likely to feel the negative impacts of that. But let's think about this. So if we're looking to design democratic participation, we're also looking at undesigning undemocratic participation or non-participation. I know it's a very clumsy way to think about the words, but let's think about our institutions as they are, and we might include museums and others in that, top down. exclusive and elitist, rubber stamping, where people are asked, they're consulted on something that's already essentially been decided, or they're given a decision making on a tiny, tiny part. Institutions operating in their own self-interest rather than society's interest. Competition between institutions, which we see more and more of with declining public funding, makes them more competitive. Greenwashing and culture washing we see all over the place. Institutions that are only really welcoming to those that have particular viewpoints or values, or that situations where people are viewed as the problem for institutions to fix, while institutions are seen as the saviors. But what have we thought about it the other way around? Then it's not necessarily people that are the problem, it's the institutions and norms that are the problem that people are then subjected to. So to go back to the discussion there before about whether or not people should buy electric cars, it's like, well, people have no choice. If I go to a supermarket, after this, and I don't want to buy plastic packaging, I'm going to have to go to another shop because everything is in plastic packaging. We need to look at the structure in this. But let's go back to a really fantastic quote this is from Eleanor Roosevelt. This is one of my favorite quotes. This is what she called the great question of where, after all, do human rights, universal rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood that he or she lives in, the school or college he or she attends, the factory, farm or office where he or she works. Such are the places where every man, woman and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. And I love this quote, and I think it should be applied to all public institutions, of course, because they should be the small places close to home that can support more people to claim their rights in society. And of course, this is the usual framework, where states are supposed to respect people's rights and not interfere with them. They're to protect the rights of everyone from being interfered with by third parties, especially commercial interests, but also to fulfill rights, to really work very hard to enable more people to claim their rights in society through their institutions. So this isn't about anything more than institutions providing people what they should expect by rights. It's not about largesse or doing noble things. It's what the institutions are surely there for. And so to return to the COP26, I was at COP26, been working on climate change and museums for 20 years now. So it's 30 years ago this year that the original Framework Convention was drawn up in one of the Rio, from the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. So in the original Framework Convention, it has an article in it, Article 6, which is about the importance of six things: education, training staff, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and international cooperation on climate change matters. So all of the governments of the world acknowledged the importance of this 30 years ago. Fair enough, they didn't do enough to support it, but let's also say that the institutions that could have supported it didn't really play their part either. And so this is one of the challenges: is the governments sign the treaties and so on, but for various reasons, some good and some not so good, the sectors just don't know. They just don't see the importance of supporting these things. And so there was a new programme adopted in Glasgow, it's called the Glasgow Work Programme for Action for Climate Empowerment, which specifically mentions museums, cultural and educational institutions. That's been recognised in the climate change negotiations for a few years now. And so I wrote this guide, it'll be out in April, really to help move these things much faster, because if we rely on the top-down approach, it doesn't happen. But also, this, as I say, the sectors need to pick up the bat and see, okay, this relates to us. This is our duty, essentially. So what is this all about? So this is really all about, human rights and a rights-based approach that acknowledges that all people are rights holders. Then organizations that impinge on their rights, they have duties. Rights-based approaches seek to narrow the gap. so that more people can claim their rights through institutions and more institutions can fulfill their obligations to society and to people in general. It would be a great thing if more people used this. And I'll talk about 3 examples of different ways that we can think of this working. So firstly is to think, well, what are the kind of the challenges and how we relate to the international and national agreements and so on. That's the aims of transforming our world, Agenda 2030 for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that are shown in the middle there. That acknowledge that governments have a role to play for sure, but they can't do the stuff they can't do this on their own. The idea that people are going to read all of these conventions and very complicated and often very niche agreements, it's just never going to happen. And there are so many treaties, agreements, conventions, there are 500 plus environmental agreements. It's just too many. And so the way to look to kind of simplify this is Agenda 2030 and the goals. And they do a great thing because rather than one sector having to explain to another sector what it's all about, what its priorities are, what its challenges are, what its timescale is, because that's actually the problem, is to say, okay, here's 17 challenges. Let's find people who are interested in the same things, and then let's work it out afterwards. Let's see what can we do together that we can't do alone, and that will support sustainable development. It's often very poorly understood that it's not intended to be a top-down agenda. It's intended to be much more participatory. The targets were developed through a 3-year consultation across society, so they have a social mandate, and they're a fantastic thing, in my opinion. So let's think of another one. How can we just totally reimagine the institutions as they are? This was a competition that I was involved in for COP26. We launched the competition in 2020, asking people everywhere, what kind of institutions do you need to support the climate action that you want to take? So rather than thinking that the institutions are right and people are, as I say, somehow just they participate in that, let's think about actually help people to have opportunities just to reimagine the institutions themselves. Because it's rather unlikely that we're going to solve 21st century problems with 19th century institutions. And so we had the exhibition on show for COP26. We have a website with about 80 of the ideas from all over the world, with 264 submissions from 48 countries. So this is an example of how we can use just the idea of a museum to promote that participation that I talked about as part of the Paris Agreement. You know, how can we help people reimagine the very structure of the institutions? And we have the book and the practical toolkit that you can get for free. And so here's an example from Indonesia. So what if people gathered their own collections and information for climate action? It came from a team in Jakarta where the main climate impacts Jakarta is very badly affected by land subsidence. Its city's sunk something like 5 meters, is incredible. And to use some of those standard museum practices of collecting and labeling and so on, but where it's the community who are telling the story and shaping the story. They laid it out on top of a ping pong table. This is in Glasgow Science Centre at COP26. And so just to give some examples from a small traditional museum that I worked with called the Whitaker Museum in Rawtenstall in the Pennines, is a former mining town, a former mill town. So what do museums do? They have galleries, but you have often rather little opportunity to respond or to shape them or whatever. So here we have a traditional gallery that explores the past and the present. It looks at the relationship between society, the economy and environment over time in the past and in the present. And then it's paired with a co-curated gallery where people are encouraged to reflect on that and say, well, what kind of place do we want to live in? And what kind of world do we want to live in? Where people respond either as part of events or in discussions. And this is really one of the great things that a museum can do, is to ask questions, and invite people to respond. It has an exhibit there about the human rights, because if we don't know our rights, it's pretty clear we're never going to be able to claim them. Yeah, we have questions. So also questions asked, well, what should the museum be doing? Because the museum is also a voting station, which I love that idea that it's a democratic institution. When people go to vote, but we took that idea and said, well, what should the museum be doing next year? To give opportunities for people to shape what is in the museum and to respond to it. Of course, it has the sustainable development goals on the wall there. And so this is not at all about looking at taking a kind of global program and shoehorning it into a local context. It's about helping to connect the old-fashioned idea of think local and think global and act local. It's not just about taking the global to the local, but helping people to have opportunities to bring their voices, concerns, fears, and aspirations to what they want the future to be like.
Come in, it's Henry.
Yeah. And so essentially we can redesign everything about our institutions and our society, whether it's the institutions themselves, our exhibitions, events, our relationships, our viewpoints, and many more things, in order to promote rights-based climate change awareness, education, participation and action as part of wider sustainable development. And if you want some more information, there's my contact details there, and that's the end of my talk, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry. I think you're still sharing your slides. Brilliant, thank you so much, and thank you to all of our panelists. So in each of those talks, there was a real sense of connection, I think, between thinking about people and their actions. So these were variously framed as practices, choices, rights, the relationship then to structures, systems and laws, the relationship to the more than human, and thinking about how these could be linked, connected, designed or imagined differently. So we're going to open up to conversation now. And there's questions already coming in through the chat, so do keep them coming. But in the first instance, what we're going to do is enter into conversation between the panelists. And so I'm going to ask if any of the panelists would like to raise any points of connection or questions they have for their co-panelists, and then open to everybody else. As you start to see connection and questions you'd like to explore, do put them in the chat, and then we'll filter that into the conversation. So panelists, any questions that you have for each other, or any lines of inquiry you'd like to open up that connect, or perhaps draw attention to differences in your talks?
Yeah.
Thank you, Robyn.
I'll jump in. Thank you very much, Victoria and Henry. I really enjoyed those. Victoria, I have a question for you, which I was really prompted by your slide on behavioural realism. It reminds me of a book by Neil Evenden, a Canadian, called The Environmentalist Dilemma. And I'm going to paraphrase it to suit my purposes here. And it's about if you keep playing to individual self-interest, you're more likely to win the immediate political battle, but you'll lose the long-term moral war, in the sense that we're not stretching people's imagination, extending their boundaries of concern, making them think differently. So, this was the environmentalist dilemma. We might lose the battle in this case if we don't say, oh, you can have a car, it'll just be electric. You can have all these consumer goods, they'll just be powered on green energy, which will just lead to the rebound effect. On the other hand, getting publics to think in a broader sense, to be reflective, to think that maybe we can't have everything, maybe there's some sacrifice here, but there will be co-benefits and we'll be averting a whole lot of costs. So in looking at norm change, I guess I'm asking you, this is a really hard question because I don't have the full answer to it. How would you navigate the environmentalist dilemma? In terms of playing to self-interest versus trying to have a sense of enlarged thinking about the problem.
Yes, it is. I don't have like a full answer to this. I think one chance that we have in this is kind of to think about it like in our our responsibility to kind of to future generations, and particularly to our children. In a way, we know that from from for instance generation like who were migrating, like who were sacrificing many things to enable better lives for their children, right? So they were sacrificing things because they thought like, I need to do that for my children so they have like a better future. So I think in that regard, I think like, you know, the whole movement of children kind of protesting and saying you have a duty of care for us, right? You are like, it's our future that is in your hands because we don't have any vote, right? And we cannot even like, you know, make any political decisions. I think that's why it's so powerful, because it plays like to this like very strong sense, I think, that most of us have, like, you know, it's kind of the responsibility for our children, and where I think the most likelihood like that we are able like and willing to maybe sacrifice things, some of our comforts, to say we're doing this for our children, for your generation. I think like this is like, you know, where I see the biggest, I think, chance for us to be willing to sacrifice things, because we understand like, you know, the link, how it is impacting our own kind of children. So yeah, I mean, that's just really my hope, I guess.
Can I just respond to that I think so much of the discussion follows a kind of market-based approach of what people are going to have to give up, rather than what are the things that people really value and what they want. And I think there's opportunities for institutions like museums, for actually, because I talk about them all the time. You know, I'll give you an example. So I did an exhibition about this back in 2015. It was about climate change. And the argument being that people often assume that they care more about the environment than other people do. But if people don't have the opportunity to experience one another's viewpoints, they just have that kind of echo chamber. So how do you burst the echo chamber? So we did it with just big jars where people had to vote about, well, what are the things that you care about? It encourages people to make up their own mind, to express it, and to find out what other people think. Yeah, that's my response.
Right, so we've actually got a question that's asking Robyn for a little bit more detail on the dynamic between mitigation and adaptation from Rachel in the chat. And I think that might be really useful to see some of this other kind of conversation that we're starting. So Robyn, I don't know if you can say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and firstly, Henry made a point about that. I actually agree with what Henry said. I think maybe I didn't make my argument clear enough. We obviously need to do mitigation and adaptation together all the time and try and synergize them as much as possible. The point I was making there was simply, I see greater democratic potential in and a greater resonance with publics at the local level, talking about getting them to mitigation via adaptation rather than just in terms of its democratic potential. But that wasn't meant to be put as an argument that we shouldn't take our eye off mitigation. That's absolutely crucial. The more we do that, we more reduce the costs of adaptation. But those who see mitigation or climate change as an abstract problem, and all they see is local change, and the IPCC reports can now bring down the change we expect at much more fine-grained levels. So imagine, you know, slideshows in local community halls where we can fast forward what the temperature and local climate is going to be over the next 50 years. It will shock locals. You can't keep growing this. You can't keep living there. Your elderly are going to die from heat waves. This is going to happen in Australia. Dengue fever is going to move south. There's a whole range, and you'll see all these things modeled and they'll go, oh my gosh, what can we do? Well, there's a lot of things you can do in terms of preparing for that, but you have to fight the good fight for mitigation too, to reduce those costs of adaptation. So I think bringing the local impacts down to a local level, I think, has greater resonance for those who aren't necessarily part of the chattering classes, who have very everyday concerns, because the environmental resonance dilemma, as John Meyer says, is that there's many people just not preoccupied with these issues because they have more pressing ones, right? And they don't have options. They have to drive, you know, clunky cars because they can't afford new ones, and they're way off ever owning an electric car, or they can't even afford a car. So you have to kind of start with this is everyday environmentalism. You start with the local concerns, you try and get more of a collective understanding of local problems, you show them what's coming, and a bit of fear is not a bad thing. Too much can make people catatonic. But I was just trying to suggest that was a way of bringing those that don't resonate with climate emergency claims into the argument about mitigation. while never taking it, you have to do both together, I guess I hope that explains my thinking a little more clearly.
Thank you, Robyn. So it's kind of, I guess, one of the questions in the chat, which I think links together all presentations in different ways in terms of thinking about what strategies might be most effective in enabling people to respond in different ways. So there's the kind of ideas, Victoria, that you were talking about kind of imagining the environment through the AI generated letters, or the kind of ways of figuring the idea of future generations. And I think, Henry, in your examples, you were looking at how different display techniques and different kinds of participatory exhibitory modes might create different kinds of potentials for engagement. So I don't know whether there's a kind of reflection on whether there's, what the different stakes are in choosing those different kinds of techniques.
I mean, if I can respond to that, as well to some of the previous comments, that like there is no one simple solution to all of this stuff, or it would have been done already. I think like it's kind of known that that appealing to future generations is not a panacea to this. Also, that one of the great motivators that there is in climate action is recognizing that it will impact more on people who are poorer than yourself. That's well known. And so, but how can we help more people gain access to the information? As I mentioned, that it's in the Paris Agreement and so on, but it might be in the Paris Agreement, but my God, it's not what we see in society. Thinking about the education, the training, the public awareness, public access to participation is miles away. We need to create more opportunities for that. And personally, I don't have the mindset that this is about changing people's behavior, because that doesn't follow a rights-based approach. Like rights-based approach from right to development is that people should be able to participate in the structures and the services that they are provided with. I think creating more opportunities for that will actually help to, should help to change things. That's what I would like to see.
Yeah, I just wondering. So if you have this approach, but do you perceive that people as quite just basically as passive recipients of services? I mean, do they have, what kind of agency do they have?
I don't think that's how things should be, but I think that is largely how things are. And I think we see this in institutions or whatever, where people who are relatively high consumers, they have little contact with broader society. Broader society just becomes the recipient of the programs it develops. This is the opposite of a rights-based approach that looks for, what I showed the diagram, giving people more opportunities to talk about, well, what are their hopes, fears, aspirations, what they would like community to be like, what risks they think they face, and how the institution can support that. So let's take an example. So how many museums or cultural institutions talk about what the local climate impacts will be is really a very small number. So how can we, it's a very obvious thing, in terms of adaptation. The first thing is that people know what the risks and the challenges are. That would seem to be a start.
Thank you so much. So there's a question in the chat from Valentine, which is really about citizens' assemblies, and that as a particular strategy, obviously called for, as Robyn was pointing to, from Extinction Rebellion, and have been used and pioneered in different places with different kinds of effects. I was wondering if there are any reflections on that as a strategy and how it might connect into other forms of democratic engagement. Robyn, I don't know whether you can say something about that in terms of your model.
Yes, I've done quite a bit of work on deliberative democracy over the years, and there's quite a few insights about citizens' juries, consensus conferences, deliberative polls, and citizens' assemblies. And one of the biggest problems with them is that the government will happily have them talk, but they won't necessarily pay any attention to their findings. And so they go through a huge amount of work and pain and discussion and enlightenment and mutual learning. And it may have an afterglow effect on them personally, but the governments always reserve the right to make their own mind, because they say we're the democratically elected government. And that's the biggest problem. They'll only outsource them if it's something like where to locate a hazardous waste site, and then they can just basically pass on responsibility to the assembly rather than themselves. Their decisions they don't want to have to make and take any flack. So that's the biggest problem with them. That said, they work best when you get a diversity of members, because we all know that echo chambers and polarization can be alleviated through deliberation amongst non-like-minded parties. Otherwise, if they're like-minded, it reinforces what we call social sorting. The wider the variety of diversity groups, the better. Like deliberative polls can be done too, because you can poll a representative sample of the population, then put them through it. Big deliberation, they can ask, listen to experts, they can talk amongst themselves, they can read stuff, and then they're polled at the end, but they don't actually have to reach agreement. And invariably that leads decision-making to a more public-spirited decision-making. So deliberation in these contexts really do enlarge thinking, because you have to redeem all your arguments. They get laundered, as it were, by having to swivel round and see them from an other regarding point of view. And that's the beauty of deliberation. And we don't have that because of party discipline and a whole lot of other reasons. So I still believe in them, but I get disillusioned when governments won't take on board what those assemblies do. And there's a problem. You might have two different citizens' assemblies coming up with different ideas, which is not unpredictable. And then the question is, well, how representative are they? So they have to be a statistically representative or significant sample of the population to have that representative quality. But as a supplementary democratic institution is important. Yeah.
Thanks, Robyn. I don't know whether Henry and Victoria want to come in on that.
Yeah, so say if we think back to the like the Rio Earth Summit 30 years ago this year, like in the Rio Declaration, it talks about something like environmental matters are best handled by the participation of interested people and communities. And so like in Europe, this is recognized as there's a European convention, it's called the Aarhus Convention, that establishes 3 rights that people have. The right to environmental information on the state and health of the environment, the right to take part in environmental decision-making, and the right to seek justice when those first 2 are not met. And the thing that's kind of interesting, particularly distinctive about this, is that it enables civil society organizations to take governments to court rather than just one party, one country criticizing another one. And there's a similar agreement in South America called the Escazú Agreement, which has a different focus, which is about protecting human rights defenders, because they, so many of them are murdered. But, helping more people to understand the commitments that have already been made and what governments have signed up to do will enable them greater opportunity for them to be held accountable, surely.
I also think, like that for climate change assemblies, they're just beyond what they immediately kind of suggest, and to what extent the government is implementing those things. Though, I think in the France case, actually the government did implement some of the things. For instance, they did kind of roll out flights between very short distances, where there is a train available, which was recommended from from the climate change assembly, and which was adopted by the government. Not to the same extent as was recommended, but still, I don't think they completely dismissed everything. But I think a more important kind of role of it is to really actually engage citizens in thinking about the problem and trying to come up with solutions, in engaging with experts to really understand the problem and developing some solutions which might not be adopted by the government, but maybe the opposition will take some of the suggestions and open up the space of policies that are available, and that are then up there in the conversation of democratic space, where people can then vote on that. So for instance, when we did our online digital climate assembly, the Green parties were very interested in those results, and they said, we want to incorporate that in our local policies, what the people have suggested. So I think one has to sometimes take a more long term perspective, not just what is the immediate outcome of it, but how does it actually feed into the whole overall process of changing societies and changing the way we approach this, and how can we get people on board with the necessary changes.
May I just add, I'm glad you brought up the Aarhus Convention, Henry, because most of the rights guaranteed there are procedural. But what's really ingenious about it, that any citizen of any member state to that convention challenge not only its own government, but another government that's a party to the treaty in relation to transboundary environmental harm. So it's the best example of environmental democracy I can think of in terms of working with more fluid boundaries and kind of like a bootstrap idea of what the demos is, the democratic community. The relevant community changes relative to the problem and the horizon of the problem. But I wanted to also ask you, Henry, you've made a strong case for environmental rights for humans. You haven't mentioned about environmental rights for non-humans. And there's also another interesting series of arguments now happening in environmental political theory about Amartya Sen's human capability approach, which is now extended in terms of multi-species justice. And the Sydney Environment Network's very strong on that, led by David Slosberg. So there's, I guess, a two-pronged question. Do you see rights extending to non-humans? And do you see also the benefit of maybe thinking in more substantive terms beyond legal rights and towards active efforts to enhance all humans' basic capabilities, which was something Amartya Sen believed very strongly in?
Yeah, so I think my response to that would be that whatever I think about environmental rights is one thing, but people also have a right to, as I say, to environmental information. There's a right that people have a right to shape human rights. There's a lot of the huge discourse about the rights of nature and so on. That stuff exists. People should have access to that information and to those initiatives. Whether I'm not saying that I disagree with them in any, or because I largely agree with them, is to say that it shouldn't just come down to what I think about it. It's like people are entitled to this stuff. People are entitled to know about the developing discourse because that's how the discourse develops. You know, rights are not, of course, like commandments written on tablets of stone. They are negotiated and debated and refined in society, but creating more opportunities for people to shape that discourse would be fantastic, I think. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Good, thank you.
So there's a question in the chat from Henry, which really connects into the pace question, Robyn, that you were raising, that dilemma of urgency and emergency. And Henry, you've asked the question, how do we shift governments to step up and take more radical steps, e.g. fuel rationing of meat and dairy? So is that kind of, reflections really on this question of more radical action that might be, authoritarian in some way?
Yeah, look, that is really a very pointy and important question. The pace problem is difficult because, and this is to take up a key point that Henry's been making, it's an institutional problem. And my focus has always been on the two most significant social steering systems in this world, and they're deeply interconnected, and that's states and liberal capitalist markets, or neoliberal capitalist markets, which are mutually dependent. And as a result of that, states are fiscally parasitic on economic growth. They have to changing things to make that more possible. And at the same time, they're running down state capacity and social welfare services. And so we've got this terrible dynamic, which Ulrich Beck called organised irresponsibility. And whatever we do, we can't change this unless we can change that dynamic. And that's why I focus so much on how we might green states and green markets. And I'm always asked, are you for or against capitalism? All I say is we have to change the ship, rebuild the ship while still at sea. So we have to start with what we got and start repairing it. So it's like the Argonaut. Eventually it looks differently, although it's all been a repair job as we go. So I think this is a really big problem because those two systems have created the inertia against the sort of transformative change that we need. And so, I mean, there is a lot of democratic arguments there about forcing the pace too quickly, which truncates debate. And I think this is a tragic choice. And I don't think there's any easy way to slide out from under that tragic situation. And think of the just transition movement. They're wanting all good things to come together. Social inclusiveness, deliberation, procedural justice, but they want timeliness and boldness. They're in debt. Those two sets of things are in direct collision. And the only way I can think my way around this tension between moving quickly and boldly and doing it slow, democratically, and ensuring all the distributional problems are ironed out, is to say, we can't have them all at once. That's politically impossible. Nor should we sacrifice any wholly on the altar of any other one and give them absolute prominence. We have to keep them all in mind and do our best. And that means we can't rush fully into that transformation because it'll fall over through lack of democratic legitimation. So that's the thing that will necessarily have to slow things down. And we have no choice to try and ensure we have that democratic legitimation, because then we're on that slope to eco-authoritarianism, and that won't solve the ecological crisis. It might in the short term, but it won't in the medium and longer term. So that's the painful dilemma, and that's my own homespun way of thinking about it and trying to manage and negotiate that dilemma.
Henry, Victoria, would you like to come in on that?
I think that many people have claimed, that one of the reasons is that we don't really recognize it as an emergency, right? Because of course, if you really feel yourself, there's an emergency then, and then certain things become possible if you really see something as that needs a quick addressing, we had for a pandemic, many kind of policies were suddenly possible we couldn't even imagine 2 years before, because we clearly understood this is an emergency, we have to react now, right? And then you actually have the people support for it, because people understand, well, this is an emergency, we need to really make sure that we accept certain things, because otherwise we have people dying. So I think a lot of it is really kind of making understanding that it is an emergency as well, the climate change is an emergency. And then I think you have the democratic legitimacy for many of the policies that are at the moment seem to be quite impossible, but you have to get this understanding, and for that you need to activate everything you have to museums, activists, everything that can make this really make really this kind of come across to the population.
Yeah, I can respond to that. I think the discussion can get a little bit trapped in whether or not we're in an emergency. Whether the Anthropocene would be another discussion about the Anthropocene. Are we in a new geological period or not? These become very theoretical issues that are not necessarily so resonant with the lives of people. So if we think about, well, if we were to say, well, so climate emergency, does it facilitate a constructive and positive personal and collective response? That's a question I'm not actually sure has been answered. And what I'm interested in is to meet people from their own position, and rather than taking particular devices or whatever and trying to transplant them onto people's worldview. So it's well, what is it that people care about? To speak to people from their own position. I think that's my approach. I hope I'm not explained that very well, but as I say, the discussion can get a little bit sidelined by what I was saying about, are we in an emergency, are we not? Are Extinction Rebellion doing the right thing? Are they not doing the right thing? That doesn't necessarily facilitate the personal response, and that's what I'm interested in.
There's another dimension to emergency which connects with a different type of denialism, which is actually necessary for human functioning. And we all know about denialism, which is kind of harder to maintain now, just to deny the science or deny climate change is anthropogenic. But there's a deeper form in which, if we are to function every day, we can't live permanently in the knowledge of what's coming, because we would become dysfunctional. So that even someone like me that's been studying this all my life, I have to push it into the background if I'm going to get on with my daily grind. And we humans need our routines, and this is what ontological insecurity means. When we lose our routines, we lose our bearings, and we can't make decisions when the landscape's changing, because we have nothing to fix our plans against and to act on the world. We can't act on the world. And then we don't know ourselves. So this is at a deep ontological level, very challenging. So it's true that we're hurtling towards something very dangerous, But none of us, even those that work on this almost full time, can live with that knowledge on a daily, from minute to minute. We let it come into view, and then we let it go again to function. And this is a human, I think, how we humans get by in the world. And so it's not something I would cast any blame over, but it is kind of also part of the problem. And I don't know any way around that. But in Australia, I think there's a change happening. We've got a government that's been denials for a long time, who is actively supporting fossil fuels. The Prime Minister brought a lump of coal into Parliament, said, do not be afraid of this lump of coal. He went on holiday to Hawaii during the Black Summer fires. And when he came back to try and do photo ops in front of victims, they wouldn't shake his hand. He was late on arrival or in responding to the floods. We've got an election in May. Hopefully, we'll see a big change in Australia. So loads of Australians now who breathe thick, polluted air in the capital cities and outside Parliament House during Black Summer, and who've lost their livelihoods and their homes, are now thinking very differently about climate change, because they've experienced what I would call a real emergency, which was life-threatening and harmful. And of course, this will live on in post-traumatic stress disorder for a lot of these folk, but it fades for those not directly. But as the timing between each of these events, as the space between them narrows, we may have to be living in emergency mode in the way that Ukrainians are at the moment. And that's not too far away if we don't get to zero fast. So these are the horrible things we have to take on board.
Thank you so much, Robyn. I think Robyn's words there are crucial words to end on and for us to take forward beyond this event. I just want to thank all of the panelists so much for such a rich, interesting discussion that I think really showed that we need to have a kind of plurality of perspective that also has very soft eyes and nuance in terms of how to navigate this. That's been very much a key thing that I will take from this conversation. So thanks to you all so much. I'm going to pass back to Christina now for the final closing.
Thank you very much, Helen. And yeah, I totally agree. It was a really, really interesting webinar with lots for us to take forward and think about. So thank you very much for everyone, again, for being here, and obviously, especially for our speakers. Just to let you know that we've got more events coming up later on the 28th of April. We have Dr. Sean Hawthorne from Liverpool University to talk about bringing the public back in, public opinion and power sharing in Northern Ireland. So actually, we're not going to be talking about climate change, climate emergency, but we're going to talk about a lot of the things we'll be talking about today, and how to involve the public in, or how to link in better institutions and public. And then later on, we're going to talk about ordinary citizenship. What does that mean in today's context in July? So there's plenty more to come into carry on this conversation, even though we'll not be focused on climate change, but a lot of the issues are the same. So again, thank you so much for coming today, and it was a pleasure to listen to all three speakers. Can we please show our appreciation again before we go, though? Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank you.